Hello, Houston. We're going to start a lecture here today. What we're going to actually talk about is going to be the parts and periphery of the nervous system, and in essence, we're going to start with the divisions of the nervous system. Everything up to now has been oriented around the individual neuron itself, and now what we're going to start doing is combining them and looking at what happens in terms of how we organize the system. So in essence, although I'm going to mention this now, we're actually going to hold off talking about this, but the nervous system itself is composed of two components. The central nervous system, which involves the brain and the spinal cord, and I will come back and talk about those as we get into section 2 of the material. For now, I'm going to look only at the peripheral nervous system, which peripheral nervous system itself has two components. So although it looks complex, there is actually a logic behind why things are divided in the way they are. The somatic nervous system is composed of two parts, which we have actually already talked about, although we didn't label them in exactly this way. And that is in the operation of the reflex itself. The somatic nervous system has two components to it, or two subsystems, if you want to think about them that way, the sensory and the motor system. And as we described in describing the reflex circuit, the sensory motor system is the afferent or inbound sensing system. So if anything happens out in your body anywhere, a message is inbound on the sensory portion of this what's called the somatic nervous system. And that in fact involves any inbound signals. The other is the motor portion of the somatic nervous system, and these are outbound signals. This is when the brain is telling the body you need to move this or lift this or scratch that or whatever. So in essence, we have the peripheral nervous system divided first of all into the somatic nervous system. That is the vast majority of the nerves outside the brain itself. So the somatic nervous system basically is all of the nerves in the arms on both sides and the legs and some portion of the trunk. But the trunk itself is also constituted of another nervous system, and that is the autonomic nervous system. So basically, the somatic nervous system is entirely inbound and outbound signals. In other words, it is nothing more than a signal system. The autonomic nervous system also carries signals, but it serves a monitoring function. Because in essence, and one way to keep these separated is that the somatic nervous system deals with the body itself. The autonomic nervous system deals with what you and I could call automatic processes. In other words, the autonomic nervous system is controlling basically the organs of the body. And it does so in a very interesting way. Unlike any other place in the body, there are actually two subdivisions of the autonomic or automatic nervous system, i.e. the nervous system that controls essentially unconscious processes. Okay? One of these is what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, and the other is what we call the sympathetic nervous system. And if you look on the diagram here, you will see that they both innervate the same sections of the body. That is, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic ganglia end up being related to operations primarily in the main trunk of the body. And in fact, I can show this to you a little more explicitly on this diagram, where if you bother to run down the words, and I don't know whether those are big enough so you can actually see them, but in essence what it's demonstrating is that the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system both innervate all of the major organs of the body. The reason for that is that what we've got is what is called reciprocal innervation. That is, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system are simultaneously innervating all of the major organs of the body itself. The reason for that is that we want to have very precise control over how rapidly those portions of the body are operating. The parasympathetic nervous system you could think of as the quiet one. The parasympathetic nervous system is a conserver of resources. What it generally does is to cause the body to increase digestive processes. It slows circulation of the voluntary muscles, and it increases circulation right past the alimentary, the central digestive canal of the body, picking up nutrients as they're being digested and distributing them to the fat storage sites all over the body. So the parasympathetic system is normally active when you're quiet. After you've been sitting watching these tapes for 10 or 15, 20, 30 minutes, by then the parasympathetic nervous system is predominantly involved in digestive processes and facilitating the storage of energy. By contrast, the sympathetic nervous system could also be referred to as the emergency system. It is the system which expends resources. One psychologist suggested that the sympathetic nervous system is involved in the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and sexual behavior. So we can look at that in the following way. That is, if we compare the activities of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, you see some comparison of the differential effects that you get. That is, that in the heart, when the sympathetic system is active, the heart accelerates. When the parasympathetic system is active, the heart slows down, and so forth, as you can see across each of them. There is a reverse relationship between the heart and the digestive system in terms of the impact of this system, of these systems, I should say. And so basically what you've got is a balanced firing process where both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic both innervate the major organs. And the result is, what this permits is very precise control over the actual operating speed of each of those major systems. And thus, when you're in an emergency situation that requires a lot of physical activity, the sympathetic nervous system increases heartbeat, increases breathing rate, and shuts down the digestive processes. If you've ever read about somebody in a panic situation, you will sometimes hear a phrase such as frozen in panic or indecisive. The reason that happens, the reason that freeze occurs, is that if they have been in a resting state, that is, if the parasympathetic system has been active in them, and something happens, it might happen to you on the interstate where you suddenly think, this is going to be bad. The parasympathetic system fires up very rapidly, but what happens is, all of a sudden the heart is finding itself subjected to two very different signals. The parasympathetic system is saying calm down. The sympathetic system is saying speed up. And the same is true of each of the other organs. Some systems, one system is telling it to speed up, the other is telling it to slow down, or the reverse. And so in essence, it's getting two conflicting set of signals. And what it basically has to do is to wait for the cortex to sort things out, process what the nature of the anxiety is, and then authorize the sympathetic system, in fact, to increase its firing rate. And so there is that kind of momentary before an activity actually occurs, and that's because for a short time there, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems are firing simultaneously. The net effect is a pause until the signals get themselves straightened out. Now, let's look at one other system that can actually impact the body before we get into looking at the brain and the spinal cord, and that is the glands. We have two different general classes of glands, and in order to understand what I'm talking about, think about the body essentially as a piece of construction pipe or pipe. The exocrine glands secrete through the wall of the pipe either direction. Okay? What I mean by that is, one example of the exocrine glands are sweat glands. You and I get hot, we start perspiring. Okay? The sweat glands secrete through the outer wall of the pipe to the outside world to dampen our body. By contrast, the endocrine glands secrete into the digestive system. Scratch that. The exocrine glands, involving, for instance, saliva, secrete into the alimentary canal, that is, into the digestive system of the body. So in essence, all of the exocrine glands are secreting through the wall of the pipe, either to the inside to facilitate digestion or to the outside, for instance, to facilitate cooling. All right? Those are the exocrine glands, and psychologists basically are not interested in them. That's more in the function of biologists' interests. However, we are interested in the other set, and that is what are called the endocrine glands. The endocrine glands basically serve the purpose of modifying behavior in the long term. In the same way that the nervous system functions or fires very rapidly, the endocrine system also impacts our behavior, but does so much more slowly. If you think back to early adolescence, you will remember that things started changing in your body quite rapidly. That's because of the relative effects and the contributions of the testes or ovaries and the hormones which they are secreting. It is, however, a very long-term effect in terms of effects that are generated by the endocrine glands. Specifically, you may be old enough to remember that Bush 1, that is the first Bush, the senior Bush, when he was president, near the end, in the last 6 months or so, had very bad relations or deteriorating relations with the press. And it was discovered partway through this session that he had a thyroid problem. And once it was announced that it was a thyroid problem and that corrective drugs were being applied to rebalance the contributions of the thyroid to now ex-President Bush's basic functioning, What happened was that his relations with the press, which had really deteriorated, I mean, normally he'd had very affable relations with the press throughout his presidency, and he had a lot of press conferences, and the interaction was quite warm. But for several weeks, it had even gotten bad enough that some of the news people were beginning to comment on the fact that he seemed very brusque, that he was dismissive, that he was assertive and even aggressive in some of the interactions. Once the thyroid was rebalanced, the normal affable relations returned. And in essence, what you were seeing there was a kind of a long-term change that in that case was being attributed to the thyroid gland. And once the hormones being generated in his body were rebalanced properly, relations returned to essentially normal. That's another example of a very long-term change, which is attributable in this case to the endocrine glands. And so basically, what we're going to do now is to switch into looking at the nervous system specifically, and I'll get you on the screen here in just a second once we get ready to go. There we are. We're going to look now at essentially the central nervous system. So although I skimmed by it earlier, now let's stop and kind of analyze it in some detail. Specifically, the central nervous system is composed of two parts. First of all, the spinal cord. Your spinal cord is roughly 1/3 as long as you are tall. So if you're 5 feet, you've got a spinal cord that's about 1 foot 8 inches long, or about 20 inches long. If you're 6 feet, you've got a spinal cord that's roughly 2 feet in length. And at the top end of it, at one end, is the brain, which is a significant swelling of that spinal cord into what we're going to see is a very complex structure. The other component in this system, in addition to the spinal cord, as you can see, is the brain. If we look specifically at your brain constitutes about 2/3. I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking here. Your brain weighs about 2% of your total body weight. Now that does not mean that when you get ready for an exam, you can eat a whole bunch of stuff, get overweight, and become fat, become smart immediately. It doesn't work that way. But relative to your ideal body weight, your brain is about 2% of that total weight. That is the reason that men are smarter than women. Write that down. No, in fact, the key figure there and what governs brain size is essentially two things. First of all, the size of the organs or body part that has to be controlled, and secondly, the complexity of what you can do with each of those organs or body parts. It is for that reason and that reason only that the male brain is in fact slightly bigger, absolutely, than the female brain, but the reason is that the average male body is bigger than the average female body. But proportionally, for both of us, it's about 2%. And neither of us has a claim on absolute intelligence by virtue of brain size. It's about the same proportion of control cells for both of us, so relax. However, the similarity continues even further than that, and that is that we can look at three major components of the brain. One of these is the hind brain, which we locate, as you can see here on the slide. And I'm going to come back and comment on the subdivisions of each of these. Secondly, we have the midbrain, which has many fewer subdivisions. That is located, as you might expect, near the middle of the brain. And in fact, thirdly, we have the forebrain, which is everything else, all of the stuff that is piled on top, if you want to think about it that way. So let's go back and look at the function of each of those portions of the brain and start with the hindbrain. The hindbrain, in fact, let me back up and also explain. What I'm going to do basically is to start at the bottom of the brain, the spinal cord essentially, and work up through the brain. In doing so, what we're going to find is that the most basic processes of life are taken off or controlled at the lowest levels, and the further up in the brain we go, the more sophisticated are the processes which are controlled there. If I were to ask you to imagine what the room that you're sitting in now would look like if it were redecorated in modern furniture, what you're doing there is engaging in a very high cerebral kind of activity involving the cortex and the very most sophisticated areas of the brain. There are more basic processes which are controlled lower, and you'll see as we work up through the parts of the brain, the processes controlled become more sophisticated as we work up through the brain. So the hindbrain itself has the medulla, it has the pons, and it has the cerebellum. Those are the three major areas of the hindbrain, and we can locate each of those for you on the diagram as follows. Within the hindbrain, we're looking first of all at the medulla, which is it's the very first swelling that we see at the upper end of the spinal cord as the fibers are entering the brain. If you find somebody lying down on the ground and you want to check to see whether they're alive, what two things do you always check for? Pulse is one, in other words, heartbeat, and what's the other? Breathing, yes, breathing. So we check for pulse and breathing. Both of those are controlled at the level of the medulla. The very lowest area of the centralized nervous system is the medulla, and that is where our heartbeat and our breathing rate are both controlled. The very most basic processes of life are the very first things that are controlled as we work our way up through the brain. The second area then that we contact is the pons. The pons is the next further enlarged swelling, the second area to be encountered as we're moving up through the spinal cord. And in essence, the medulla and the pons combine to form what is the lower part of what's called the brain stem, which is a limited area in the upper part of the spinal cord. The pons serves essentially as a major relay station for signals that are both coming in and then being relayed up into the nervous system. It also plays a role in beginning to integrate sensory information, especially from the head, and integrating those with body sensors and various motor functions that the brain ends up having to control. A related area is the third portion of the hindbrain, and that is what's called the cerebellum, which is not right on the main line. It is in fact to the backside. It is off the main line, but it serves again a mixing and integration function. That is one of the major things that the cerebellum is doing, is mixing, blending the incoming signals, and preparing them for relay either up or down in the system as necessary. The main thing the cerebellum is doing is basically taking signals from the sensors of balance and muscle tone, so that it's the primary section of the brain which is involved in making sure that you and I can stand upright and walk, okay? That we can essentially, in other words, it's integrating the major muscle groups in the body. You'll remember back in developmental, I suggested at one point that you try standing with your feet as close together as possible and your arms tucked in very tightly, and then notice how many different muscle groups are involved in actually maintaining even the very simple process of standing exactly upright and still. It's the cerebellum that is largely involved in those kinds of integrated activities, and as you sensed, if you lean out one way, you end up having to hang an arm off the other way to balance yourself out. That is largely coordinated at the level of the cerebellum. The next major section that we get to then is the midbrain, and we won't for our purposes here subdivide that, other than to point out that the midbrain is located right here. No great surprise, right near the middle of the head. Basically, this is where the last major integration of incoming sensory stimuli takes place, particularly the visual system here. And then it controls behavior that reacts to or involves interacting with visual stimuli. So if I were to toss, wad up a sheet of paper and toss it out at one of you, just throw it at you, your ability to see it coming, to get your hands up and to clamp them at the proper time to catch it is primarily a function of midbrain operations. So it is the last and the most sophisticated center for integrating signals before they're sent up into the brain for further processing. The midbrain itself is relatively small, but it's also a part of the brainstem, what is normally called the brainstem itself. And it is the only other direct input and output, that is the only other direct input-output that it has is to the eyes. So the visual signals come in to the midbrain there. It has two major roles. The one, as I've already said, is to integrate stimuli from the visual system, and the other is that it serves an alerting or arousing function. When we talk about pain in the motivation emotion section of the course, the alerting arousing function of the brain prior to processing pain information, that's brain and pain that I'm talking about there separately, is driven largely by signals coming from the midbrain into the cortex to stir things up. The last major section of the brain then is the forebrain, and that is actually divided into two subsections, if you want to think about it that way. One of them is what's called the old or classic part of the forebrain, and that involves three primary areas: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system. The reason this is referred to as the old or classic part of the brain is because if you take a course, for instance, in chordate anatomy, and you lay out the central nervous systems of various beasts of varying degree of sophistication, with us being at the top end of sophistication, what you find is that the area identified as the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system are represented physiologically further back in the organisms than are things like the cortex and the neocortex, which we'll get to here in a minute. So these are considered to be old or classic functions because they're represented further back, or to think another way to think of it is in less sophisticated organisms. And when you see the processes that are controlled here, you'll understand why that would necessarily be the case. So in essence, if we look at the old or classic part of the forebrain, there are three major things. One is the thalamus. The thalamus is right near the very center of the head, as you can see here. The second component we can look at is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a little bit further down in the head, hypo meaning under, so it is under the thalamus. And while I'm here, let me also point out that this is where the pituitary gland is located. The master endocrine gland is located right here just underneath or next to the hypothalamus. And this is where the link between the nervous system, the central nervous system, and the glandular system occurs. This is where the link is made. Recognizing again, as I stressed earlier, that the effects of the endocrine system are much slower to take place. That is, the actions, the behaviors that are impacted by the endocrine system are much more long-term rather than the immediate nature of the interactions that the nervous system itself is involved in. So in essence, here's where the link takes place, occurs between the central nervous system and the endocrine glands. It's the hypothalamus communicating directly with the pituitary gland, or the master gland. The third area is the limbic system, and it's the dark area in the diagram here, right where the twisting circle, now ellipse, actually is. What I'm going to do is jump and give you a different view here. The one unfortunate thing is that this person is facing to your right. The other one that we're about to show you is facing to the left. So hang on, but what I'm going to do is to explode that center area of the brain and look at it this way. And then what we find is that the limbic system is that kind of H-shaped mechanism that you see there. The vast majority of that is actually out in one side of the brain or the other. So when you look at a cross-section, which is what we were looking at a minute ago, there's only a very small area that is dedicated to the limbic system, but it's actually quite a bit bigger system. This area of the brain is widely attributed to be involved in the emotions, and it's had an interesting history over the last century or so. The idea at the beginning of the 20th century was that the thalamus was the seat of the emotions. Eventually it was decided mid-century that the hypothalamus was really the seat of the emotions, and I've seen some papers in recent years that have argued that the limbic system is really the seat of the emotions. Without doubt, it is the case that all three are involved in one way or another with motivated behavior, with emotional behavior. The thalamus, that area in the center, is the top area. In fact, let me back up one slide and let you see that again. And that is that the thalamus is the top of the brainstem. So the brainstem, as it's sometimes traditionally referred to, as it is traditionally referred to, basically involves the lower brain, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the thalamus portion, the thalamic portion of the forebrain. So that it's this center part of the spinal cord and brain that constitutes what is called the brainstem. You can almost think of it as a golf club if you want. If the brain itself, if the cortex itself is a boxing glove, then it's got a golf club kind of rammed up within it, and the top of the golf club is essentially the top of what's called the brainstem. The thalamus basically is where all the signals are ultimately divided. That is, it's from there that the tracks go to various areas of the brain, depending on what specifically is being processed. But if I were going to pick any one area to be my favorite for major involvement in emotional / motivated activity, it would be the hypothalamus. And in essence, the hypothalamus is involved in all of the major control of things like hunger, respiration rate, thirst, sex, temperature. Even certain amounts of circulatory decisions are made at the level of the hypothalamus, and in addition, things like salt balance and sugar balance are at least monitored in the hypothalamus. So I would argue that that is would be my favorite. If I were going to pick only one, that would be the area where I would suggest the control is most complex. But the limbic system then basically kind of is around the upper end of the brainstem. It is involved, among other things, in odor detection, but it does play a role in emotions, in paying attention, and maybe even in recent years we are beginning to suspect that it also plays a role in remembering, that is, in the storage of information. It is extremely complex, and the relations between the limbic system and the hypothalamus are very much the subject of hot study in modern times. Now, that's the older classic portion. Now let's look at the what is variously called the cortex, the neocortex, you name it. But in essence, it is the most sophisticated, the last evolved portion of the brain. It is the vast majority of the boxing glove that represents the very top of the brain. Relative to the cortex, there are several things that we can talk about. One is the fact that the cortex, unlike the lower divisions, is very cleanly divided into a left and a right hemisphere. So from here on, in this portion of the brain, we have a left hemisphere to worry about and a right hemisphere which shares functions but is somewhat different from the associated left hemisphere. One of the problems that leads to then is being able to that is, you can see what we're looking at is simply the right hemisphere of the model whose head has been exploded here. But the major function that we have in looking at cerebral cortex cortical activity is the fact that I can't diagram it easily here. So all I'm going to say is that it doesn't involve the area that is encompassed by red there. We're talking only about that top wrinkled looking portion as the cortex itself. And one of the problems that we have when we have two hemispheres is the need for those hemispheres to be able to communicate with each other. And that is actually achieved using the corpus callosum, which is in this area. It's on the slide, on the diagram here, it is the vertical striations that you see in that kind of bent, warped area in the center top of the brain. That is the area called the corpus callosum. The purpose of the corpus callosum is to facilitate communication back and forth between the left and the right hemisphere. So that, for instance, if you're watching the television right now and somebody walks across in front of you between you and the television, your ability not to see a kind of a glitch or a fade out and a fade in as they walk across is because of the fact that the two hemispheres of the brain are constantly communicating with each other. So that it's a smooth flow, even though when you're over here, the information is being processed on this side of the brain. When you're over here, it's being processed on the other side of the brain. But because of the corpus callosum, there is that constant shuffle of information back and forth. If you've ever read about split brain research, what's involved is severing the corpus callosum. What is being split in that case is simply the two hemispheres, so the left and the right are not communicating with each other. That leads to some very interesting behavioral effects. Among others, the fact that if we put you up in an apparatus when your corpus callosum has been severed, and we have a barrier that connects to your face and extends to the computer screen, we can then put a picture, for instance, of an orange on one side and 4 words on the other side identifying what the fruit is, ask you to identify which is the word identifying the fruit. You won't be able to solve the problem, because the information is stored only on the one side and it cannot reach the word choices that are stored on the other side of the brain. And so in essence, in that case, what you have is an isolation of function between the left and the right if the corpus callosum is severed. Now, it sounds kind of abusive, but in fact there are some reasons in the modern day world in some instances for actually severing the corpus callosum. If you and I met somebody with a severed corpus callosum, about the only thing you would probably notice in everyday behavior is that if they needed to see something, integrate some, when I'm looking here, if I needed to integrate something here and here, the easiest way to do it is to look over here so that both objects are on one side of the visual field. But one of the benefits of having a corpus callosum severed is that one of the major problems that we have with the brain sometimes is an epileptic seizure. And what happens through a process we don't fully understand is that an arrhythmia, a disfiring, a misfiring begins to occur in some area of the brain and will spread to enwrap the entire hemisphere. And if the corpus callosum is working, it will actually migrate to the other side and disrupt the functioning of the cortex on both sides. And the net result is somebody who is experiencing an epileptic seizure is in total uncontrollable convulsions, because the signals are totally disrupted across a wide portion of the brain. One of the benefits of actually severing the corpus callosum so that the two hemispheres cannot communicate with each other directly is the fact that it cuts the severity of the epileptic fit by as much as 60, even 70%. Because not only do you have only half of the brain malfunctioning now, but in addition you've got the fact that the part that retains conscious control can actually use the half of the body that it monitors to do things like hang on, so that the thrashing doesn't become as bad, and you reduce the likelihood that you would actually injure yourself in that kind of a situation. So that in essence the hemisphere that continues to function can aid in reestablishing cognitive order in the brain itself. So there are some situations where severing the corpus callosum is in fact actually a beneficial process. Now, in addition to the corpus callosum, the other thing that we should point out is that the hemisphere, as we've been looking at it here up on the top part of the brain, is actually, I'm going to shift views here again, is actually divided into 4 different lobes. And now we're looking at the outside. We've reassembled the head here, and we're looking at the outside of the brain in this case. The 2 hemispheres, left and right, are actually divided into 4 lobes. And those lobes actually have identifiable separate functions that we can actually identify for you here. For instance, the first lobe is the occipital lobe. First one that I'm going to talk about anyway is the occipital lobe. This is located at the back. It was lonely in the office when I was putting this together, so I dressed it up a little for you. But in essence, the occipital lobe here is at the lower back part of the head. It's this back lower part of the brain, and it's located as encircled in blue here. Its primary function is to process visual stimuli. Hugh Bell and Wiesel won the Nobel Prize about 25 years ago now for very elegant work in which they basically were able to demonstrate the way in which the cells in the occipital cortex work to translate and interpret incoming visual information. Color is processed in one place, texture is processed in a second, movement is processed in a third, size is processed in a fourth, in a highly integrated series of integrated cells. Which is redundant, but the point is that there is integration across subsets of cells. We'll talk in sensory processes more about the way in which movement is detected, for instance, which is one of the things that is in fact interpreted in the occipital cortex. The second section that we'll look at is the temporal lobe, and again, if you want to think about the cortex as a boxing glove, the temporal lobe is essentially the thumb of the boxing glove, if you want to think about the cortex as a boxing glove, or kind of looking roughly like a boxing glove. The temporal lobe is the thumb of the boxing glove. The primary thing that it is involved in is auditory function, that is the operation of your ears, and it is involved in things like, just the general processing of auditory information, auditory localization, that is where a sound is coming from, and so forth, is largely a function of the temporal lobes along the side of over here on the side of the head. The third, and I'm going to do 2 of these at once and then talk about their relative function. The third is the parietal lobe, which is basically located on the top and back portion of the head, the brain, I should say. It's the top back portion of the brain. At the edge of the parietal lobe, there is a very deep infold, which very clearly and pronouncedly separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is what I'll also introduce here, and then we'll talk about the function together. But the frontal lobe is basically, as you might expect, no great surprise, located at the front. Excuse me. Notice at the very back of the frontal lobe is that infold that I was talking about before. That is normally referred to as the central sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S, or central infold of the brain. It is perhaps this, other than the thing separating the temporal lobe from the rest, it is perhaps the most visible portion of the identifier marker on the brain. There turns out to be a very specific process that's going on there. In the front end of the parietal lobe, the anterior end, if you want to use the technical term, there is is where motor control is actually exhibited. I loaned my slides last semester to a student who did not return them. So the first time in 35 years, I don't have a way to illustrate what I'm talking about here. But imagine for a moment the diagram that you've got on the slide on the screen there is a sideways view of the head, okay? What I'm going to do now is to slice the head this way. That is, I'm going to slice it right down the middle, ear to ear, fold out the front and look straight in. And when you do that, in essence, what you see is you're looking essentially, when you look at the front end, of the closest to front end of the parietal lobe is where sensory control is exhibited. So if a fly lands on your arm, I can show you an area on your brain at the front end of the parietal lobe where there is electrical activity. If, on the other hand, you decide to flinch your skin in that area, the control of that is at the back end of the frontal lobe. Interestingly enough, the two processes are directly across from each other. So if this is where the sense occurs, this is where the muscles that are directly under that sensed event actually occur. It isn't so useful in you and I because if a fly lands on our arm, we're not going to flinch our skin. We'll just reach across and bat at it. And so the actual control of that activity comes from a different part of the brain. But in less sophisticated organisms like horses, for instance, excuse me, if a fly lands on its flank, the only choice it really has other than switching tail is to flinch its skin. And the control of the muscles in the area where the fly has landed is directly across that central sulcus. Again, taking that front end view, we can also use that to diagram the relative amount of brain cells that are dedicated to the control of each part of our body. The entire lower part of our body, from waist downward, is controlled by about that many cells, and why don't we just have a picture of me for a while here now, is controlled by about that many cells located dead center in the head and going right down into the head. It's about an inch, maybe an inch and a half of cells right down in the center, which control the entire lower half of the body. The upper half, basically the trunk from waist to shoulders, is controlled by about that many cells out across the top. That is, it's migrating out from the top along the sides. Then you contact the arm, and the arm, it's kind of like you've got a super extended hand as it kind of dribbles out this way, so that you've got the upper arm with relatively little innervation, the lower arm with slightly more, and the hand with a massive amount of integration. The hand has about that many cells coming out across the side of the head, which controls simply just the activities from the wrist outward. You think about it, you've got a total of something like, I meant to count, at least 17 joints you have to count. You've got 3 for each finger, which you have to control individually. You've got the wrist itself, and you've got the opportunity to bend the hand. So there are at least 17 major joints, each of which has to be individually controlled in order for you to be able to reach down and pick something up or point at people or do whatever you want. That takes a lot of control surface. So the hand has about that much representation around roughly in this area of the head. And then the last part coming down around the sides. And remember, if we're looking straight in on the brain, I'm talking about what's happening down along the sides here. The top part of the head, well, the head itself looks very much like an accentuated Jay Leno in terms of how the brain cells are dedicated. If you kind of think of his projecting chin, proportionally representing cells on the side of the head. The largest portion of the cells controlling the mouth are dedicated just to the mouth itself and specifically to the tongue. The tongue and the hand are the two most heavily innervated and most highly controlled areas in the entire body. So the tongue and the mouth have the highest number of cells proportionally. The tongue down here and the hand up about here, coming down along the sides of the center part of the brain. I will show you when we get into sensory processes what is called two-point touch threshold, and the fact that in our head, on our body, I mean, we can detect 2 points touching us simultaneously when they're closer together on the tip of our tongue and on our fingertips than anywhere else on our body. And coming back to my original point relative to brain size, that's because of the relative number of cells that we have controlling just those 2 areas of the body. Now let's go back and look at the kind of study techniques that we can utilize. There are really 3 different techniques that are utilized in studying the brain. One is histology, and this is a watching technique as one of 3. Histological sectioning is what was used with Charles Whitman, the deranged person who went up the tower at the University of Texas a little over 30 years ago now and killed about a dozen, 15 people on a very tragic workday afternoon. After he was killed and the solution, the problem was solved, his brain ultimately was sectioned. That is, it was microsectioned into very, very thin slices of neurons. And neurologists then were able to trace individual nerve tracks by staining sections of the brain that way. And they were able to identify that he apparently had a very large swelling, a cancerous growth, in an area of the brain that would normally have controlled voluntary activity and particularly things like the emotions. And so at some level, he was not really responsible, apparently, for the travesty of the murders that occurred that day at his hand. The second technique that we can also use is a recording technique, which I'm going to talk about more a little bit later. But in essence, we can implant electrodes into you and measure using what is now called an electroencephalograph. I'll hold off and come back and talk about that. Second technique we can utilize is stimulation. That is, we can turn the system up somehow or stimulate it. We can implant electrodes into your head and record activity, or we can put electricity into the head, millivolt stimulation, and see what effect stimulation of the brain has on various kinds of activities. The second possibility, instead of using electrodes, is to use chemtrails instead. Chemtrails are an interesting device. They're a shaft within a shaft, basically. Kind of like, as you know, a hypodermic needle is a narrow shaft of metal that is hollow inside. Well, with a chemtrail, what you do is put a shaft within the hollow shaft and then implant both of them into the head. And by the length of the shaft, you determine where in the brain the end of the chemtrail is. Once it's implanted, you remove the center shaft, put the drug that you want to study the effects of onto, the end of the inner shaft, and then reinsert it, and the drug then is released in that area. Not as precise as electrical measurement and electrical stimulation, because there are fluids moving within the brain, but you can still get at least some impact of some understanding of what chemicals in a particular area, how they impact the operation of the drug, of the brain, I mean. The third possibility is to vary the sensory input. That's the way Hugh Bell and Weasel did it when they developed our understanding of the occipital cortex. In essence, they did two things. First of all, they operated on the frogs, so that the frogs that were studied, so that they could measure electrical activity at various places in the frog's occipital cortex. And they then used a dark visual field, which the frog could see, and put pinpoints of light in various places. So they tried moving the lights, they tried different color lights and so forth. So they had sensory stimulation coming in, that is stirring the system, and then they were recording electrical activity in the brain at the time. The third way to study the brain is to actually suppress the brain's activity. In this case, what we're going to do is one of several things. Again, we can use either electrodes or chemtrails for doing this. But in some ways, the most illustrative and the most instructive is what is called destruction. Now, that doesn't mean that we go in and simply mess up your brain and then study the effect. We humans do enough goofy things that, in fact, we are often able to find people who have various kinds of brain destruction that has taken place, so that we can look at what area is destroyed, and then infer from that control of that area on whichever behavior is actually messed up. This was actually the source of our understanding of speech-language centers and the brain control that is exercised in controlling speech-language. You will remember I said I would come back later. The area that is outlined in white there is the major area that is involved in control in brain control of speech. It is actually a very complex activity, because in some cases you're watching people to infer what their mouth is saying. In some cases, you're listening to people. In some cases, you're talking to them. So there are actually several different activities, all of which get folded into speech language as a concept. So we can't just point a finger and say that's where it is, but we can actually come surprisingly close. And this is the work that was done studying what is called aphasia. Aphasia is essentially a physiologically based problem with language. It's a brain damage caused problem with normal processing of speech. It turns out we have 4 different vehicles by which we can and do typically communicate. We can communicate outbound in terms of speaking or writing, and we can communicate inbound in terms of listening or reading. It turns out, because of the way those 4 processes are controlled, we can have one of those processes messed up by brain deterioration and have the other 3 working perfectly well. This was actually discovered originally during the Second World War, and the research went on over a number of years, but in essence what it boiled down to was being able to demonstrate behaviorally, first of all, that you and I exhibit what is called receptive aphasia, or that's one possibility. That's a problem with incoming information. Somebody who has a receptive aphasia cannot understand either what they're reading or what is being spoken to them. Okay? They have an input problem. The other possibility is that instead we have what is called expressive aphasia. In expressive aphasia, they have difficulty expressing outward, either writing or talking. The way in which this was actually discovered and demonstrated is rather interesting. It's a story in and of itself. But by the time large numbers of veterans were coming back from the Second World War, and particularly the Korean War, with significant head injuries, those soldiers also had Veterans Administration's benefits and began demanding services, began demanding help with getting these problems fixed up. Obviously, to fix the problem, you need to understand it. And some smart cookie in the Veterans Administration organization, I believe it's the original source, came up with the idea that, well, look, we've got these 4 different types of communication disorders, i.e. aphasias. Let's see if we can take one group, for instance, an expressive aphasic, and study what area of the brain is involved. And so the key maneuver here was, first of all, to use X-rays and then to tie it to particular behavioral abnormalities. So what they did was to take people who had an expressive aphasia, specifically the inability to verbalize, and they took an X-ray of their head always from the same perspective, same distance, same size, and then what they did was to take the X-rays, superimpose them on each other, and have a computer look through all of the X-rays, that is essentially electronically look through the X-ray, asking the question, is there an area of the brain that is always involved when we see an expressive aphasia, difficulty with talking? And the answer, surprise of surprises, turned out to be yes. And that's what led to the identification of Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are 2 of the major processing centers for spoken and listened to language. As an expressive aphasic, that is someone who has an expressive aphasia, one of the things you would notice is that if you took him or her out and pointed to an object on the campus here at the U of H and asked them, what is it? You would hear them say trunk, tree, leaves, branches, twigs, green, and so forth. And they're doing what is called circumlocute, that is, they're talking around the concept, but they can't look at that object and say, oh, that's a tree. And yet, if you took them to your apartment and showed them the device that you put into your shoe to help it maintain its shape when you're not wearing it, and asked them what that is, they'd say, oh, that's a shoe tree. So it's not the inability to say tree that they're having difficulty with. It is rather the inability to retrieve the symbol, the symbolic representation of tree in the brain. So aphasia turns out to be a fascinating area for study of brain function related to external behaviors. Now let's at least launch ourselves into the last area, that is altered states in physiological psychology. I'm going to limit my discussion here to naturally altered states of consciousness, of which we have quite a number. If you want to have artificially altered states, go take the introductory pharmacy course, because that's where they cover drug effects, which we won't deal with. But we have several naturally altered states that we can talk about. To die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dream may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. Who's speaking? Hamlet, you're right. Which act? Which play? Hamlet, yes. Oh, you guys are sharp today. Which act? 3. Which scene? 1, you're right. Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet. What he's talking about, of course, is sleep. And our understanding of sleep actually had to await the development of 2 processes. One was computers, or 2 mechanisms. One was computers, and the other was the development of an ability to measure electrical activity in the brain. That is what's called, the mechanism that does that is what's called an electroencephalograph. We're going to start our discussion next time with showing you how we do that electrical measurement and what relations, what information it gives us about the nature of sleep as an activity. See you then.